Hello, welcome to the Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm in charge of documentation, and I'm joined today by Dion McCormick, who is going to talk to you about data sources, right?
That is correct.
All right, so without further ado, I'm going to make you the presenter, Dion.
Thank you.
And I can see your screen, so yeah, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Unfortunately, our other Dave can't make it today. He's a little bit under the weather. We're sorry to hear that. Hopefully he'll recover quickly on that. But want to say thank you very much for taking your valuable time and joining us here. We're mid-summer here. Man, almost like August. We're really right around the corner from August. That's crazy. Summer's been going by really, really quick. And I hope everybody's enjoying their summer, having a lot of good opportunities to go out and play and enjoy and spend time with the family and travel. And we really, again, appreciate you taking the time to join us. So today, we're kind of doing a back to basics kind of focus. And the idea is, we often kind of cover the latest release, the latest new feature, and sometimes those are very specific and sometimes very detailed and very, kind of, let's call it a geeky. But, sometimes you want to kind of have an overview of a core functional, because we have a mix of people who are on these webinars, both experienced developers and new ones, and sometimes you can learn from the basics. So we'll see today. But I wanted to say thank you. And first, before that, do realize coming up very soon, if you go to alphasoftware.com, we've got DevCon 2021, October, August, September. Man, that's only a couple months away. So it's really coming very quickly. You can just go to the alphasoftware.com. DevCon 2021. I'll go ahead and put that into the chat window right there. And there we go. Feel free to click on that, go on over, get signed up. Still pretty good pricing on it. It will get more expensive as we get closer to the actual date, and a really incredible set of content, both training, new features, roadmaps, the developers. It's all going to be recorded in high quality, so that you'll be able to not only see it real time, but if you can't make every aspect, you can bump and watch them later on. You're really going to enjoy it. So if you get a chance, go over, click on register now, go through it, and you'll be good to go from there. So with that in mind, what I wanted to talk about today was one of the core technologies within Alpha Anywhere, and that's connection strings. And so we're going to just kind of go straight by, we're going to go through a little background. What are connection strings? How are they used? And why are they important? And also kind of how, some of the nuances on how they're put together and how you can manage and use them. And there's actually some new features on it. They continually improve it. And there's a really cool new feature I'll show towards the later part of this presentation about that. So connection strings are critical. You can build a static website with Alpha, and you don't need data to drive the website. You can do all that. But the reality is almost everybody we're working with in some way, shape, or form is building a transactional website or transactional system using Alpha Anywhere. Thus, if you're building a transactional system, you need to have data, and that data could be in many different locations. Now, if it's your own business, you probably have a single kind of data source. Maybe you've selected a specific database vendor, SQL Server from Microsoft, MySQL, Oracle, you name it. There's a whole wide range of them, Postgres, and companies decide, and they usually finalize on one technology set for that. But also as a developer who maybe is not just wedded to one company, you may have a situation where you're working with multiple technologies. Meaning you might have multiple types of data source. One customer uses this, another customer uses that. And last but not least is even within singular companies, especially during acquisitions and transitions as such, you may have a situation where you have one set of data in one kind of data source and another in another, because they kind of come from historical perspectives and historical implementations. So the connection string concept is super important because it makes your life enormously easy and does a lot of the work of shielding you from the complexity of these data sources. And so I'll kind of go through a little bit, explain a little bit of how they're built. Let's see, here's the agenda here. There we go. What are they? How do you build them? How do you leverage them? And some of the nuances that go with that. And then there's some very sophisticated capabilities built into Alpha, which we'll mention today. We probably won't go through a demonstration on it, that allow you to do some really powerful things with connection strings. So first, what are connection strings? Well, first and foremost, a connection string is a way to describe within the system a connection to a data source. And so there are many different data sources I'll show you in a minute, and there's more are added all the time. One of the key things a connection string does, and actually the technology below it. So we're going to talk specifically about what is a connection string, but below it is the concept of a whole set of code that's built into Alpha that understands how to use that connection string to talk to a specific data source. And you'll see later the beauty of that is once we know how to talk to it, then we can kind of decomplexity, create less complexity in terms of building an implementation, because again, the system does most of the work for you. So the cool thing about it is that the connection string has a lot of information that allows Alpha to understand, oh, this is where you want to go. This is how the data structures are. This is how the system is. This is how I'll communicate with it. All of that is encapsulated with the connection string. So the connection string is really just a description of the kind of data you're going after, where it's at, and some other elements. So, and they can look a little differently between different data sources because different data sources use different methods to connect to them. It allows you, as I mentioned, to have a normalized way to interface with those data sources. One of the beautiful things about connection strings is once you've set one up, when you go to build a grid, you don't have to know the distinct lingo to talk to that database and that table. You can basically use a point and click methodology, because Alpha inside the connection string technology has the ability to connect to that data source, but also inspect that data source. So it can actually talk to the data source and say, give me a list of your views, give me a list of your tables. Oh, for this table, give me a list of columns that are in that table. Oh, give me the information about how it's structured, etc. So built into the sort of the user interface building tools are these really powerful sort of point and click inspection tools that allow you to build very rich experiences without having to know detailed SQL lingo and things like that. Now, the cool thing is if you do, you get the best of both worlds, because the connection strings can completely use any SQL you throw at it because it passes it along to the original source. The other thing the connection string does, which for the tools, is that since we know it's a certain type of data source, and again, I kind of focus on SQL, but we handle different types of connections to different types of things, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But what's cool is that it can handle, like, how do I insert records? How do I delete records? How do I manage those kind of pieces there? Really, really powerful from there. And one last super duper awesome feature of it is that, and this is really when you get to publishing, is that often when you're in development, you're using one data set, a data source, a certain database or something like that. But when you're in production, you don't want to be using the same data source because it's sample data, et cetera. It's production. So one of the coolest things is that during the publishing process, and we'll talk about this, you can actually go in and swap out the connection strings. So when your application is running locally, it's going to use a connection string and talk to a certain database. But then you can use what's, when you go to production, you can say, no. When you're using this connection string, I actually want it to go to this database and use this information, and it will take care of handling all that redirect and other pieces from there. So it really makes your life easier when you're talking about DevOps of, develop, test, build, et cetera from there. And we'll talk about, there's connection strings and then there's called named connection strings. And we'll identify and make sure you understand the difference between those two there. Okay, so what does a connection string do? First and foremost, it really designates what is the type of the data source. So it's telling the Alpha environment, okay, here's the type of system you're connecting to, a data storage system you're connecting there. It also has location data in there, and that can vary based on the type of connection string. And I'll show you a couple examples in a few minutes in here. It also has security parameters. So if you need to have login credentials for that connection, they're embedded in the connection string, and you'll see in a few minutes that they are encrypted. So you can be sure someone hacks your system, they'll maybe be able to use it with an Alpha, but they won't be able to extract your passwords and things like that. Now, there are other parameters that go with it. It is obviously dependent on the kind of data source you're connecting with. So connection strings have a lot of sort of complexity built into it, but what's really cool, and you'll see in a moment, the system takes care of building that stuff for you, which is really handy from that standpoint. So let's look at a couple examples of what a connection string is. So here's an access example, and it kind of looks gobbledygook, but we'll walk through this and it'll make sure you understand it. So you'll see at first, there is and I'm trying to highlight this, you'll see that it's in curly brackets because this is basically a data structure that Alpha uses to extract the information needs. But you'll see at the very beginning, there's something that says A5 API equals access. So in this case, this is what's telling Alpha what kind of data source is it. And that tells it a lot. It really gives it the information saying, oh, when you want to go talk to here, make sure you talk to it in this way. The next part is a location element. So in the case of access, since it is a file, you'll see that it has a file name and then it has a physical path to that. So this one is on my local machine. You can see it was in our access databases inside the Alpha Anywhere development environment, kind of where it's stored on the local. This could be easily changed anywhere on your desktop. It doesn't have to be in the same or on your laptop or whatever. But the bottom line is that it's basically just giving it a path saying, here's the access database, here's where you can find it. And that's really handy there. And then also in this case, it's just giving you a username, but if you have locked your access, it would give you username and password. And you could have other kind of parameters that are set by the connection string from there. Another example of that is, and this is actually MySQL, look, real live stuff there. So again, concept first, A5 API equals MySQL. So it's telling you there. By the way, don't worry about having to write this. The system has builders that will do that, and we'll show you that in a few moments here. But first and foremost, you have A5 API equals MySQL. That's telling it, oh, this is a MySQL data source. The server, the port. So in this case, it is located on a network. So this is the network IP, and that's the port it's located on because you may have it on different locations. Then there's a username and password, and then the database you're trying to reach on that server. So this is it. And these are all fake numbers, so good luck. So the idea behind it is that, again, this is what Alpha needs to understand what the data source is, where it's located at. In this case, it's actually a specific database within that data source. And last but not least is, what is the password credentials that you need to be able to access that. And you'll notice that the password, and it's kind of clipped off here, but is encrypted. So you'll see that this is just an encrypted string right here. So you'll enter the password in there, but it's going to put it encrypted. So if someone got access to this, they'd be able to know where your database and what the database name is, but they would really not be able to access it because when Alpha accesses it, it decrypts this password and then actually does the connection to the database at that time there. So again, at its core, a connection string is telling you what type it is, where's the location, and any credentials and any other secondary information that's associated with that. So let's go through and talk some demonstrations, actually show you kind of how you put these things together. So we're going to create a connection string, and we're going to talk about what named connection strings are. And then I also want to talk about a new feature that was just released, and I think it's one of the cooler features. And it's a little bit on the geekier side, but it's really handy, especially if you're working with other people, and we'll explain why that's important from there. So with that, I'm going to jump over into my development environment, open up Alpha, and I've got a SQL demonstration. So first thing is I'm at the web projects control panel. So whenever you're working with connection strings, you start at the web projects control panel. Now you go to tools and you'll see under tools on the fourth item here is Alpha DAO connection strings. And this is where we manage connection strings. And by Alpha DAO, that's Alpha Data Access Object. There's some underpinning technology that Alpha uses to talk to these different things. And so we've kind of incorporated it in the name, but don't worry about that, what that means. Just think connection strings. Now, very important, there are two other types of connection strings. One are storage connection strings. Those are different. We're not really going to cover those today, but that is for connecting to web-based storage systems such as Azure, or Amazon AWS S3 buckets. So it uses the same concept of a connection string, i.e., once we set it up, it knows where to go, how to access, etc. So when you're using it inside Alpha, you don't have to know all those details. It will translate it for you. But be careful, Alpha DAO connection string are for data sources, and the storage is more for storage, web-based storage locations from there. There is also SQL Server reporting services connection strings. If you are building an interface on top of SQL Server where you want to run, SQL Server reporting services, we have the ability to connect to those systems and put those in there, so it makes it really easy to basically leverage the reporting capability, because we have a number of clients who are sort of Microsoft shops. They've already got SQL Server reporting services for all the reporting, even though Alpha has very robust reporting capabilities built into it. So it allows us to connect from there. And then last but not least, just to let you know, is named providers. Named providers are around APIs. Again, not in the scope of discussion today, but again, kind of the concept of once we set up these connections, in this case to named providers, makes your life a lot easier from there. A couple other things while I'm on this menu is you can notice you can export and import connection strings. That's pretty handy. You can basically, let's say you're setting up a new project and you're basically going to use the same data sets, for whatever reason, you can export them. It'll take that data out, put it there. It doesn't actually move your data or anything like that. It just basically exports the connection strings that you've built, so you can quickly bring those into another project without having to go through all the setup stuff. It's just kind of a nice, super easy way to handle it from that standpoint there. Okie dokie. So we're going to go into Alpha DAO connection strings, and this brings up our manager for connection strings. Now you'll notice first and foremost, name connection strings. So this is an important concept, and I want to take a moment here just to talk about what that means. Is that you'll see over here, here's that connection string. It's the source of the data or the type of data you're hitting, where it's located at, and username, password. So this is a connection string. But what we can do is we can give names to the connection string, and that's a very important concept. And so I can actually give this a name, and therefore when I'm using it in the system, I can just pick the name, and this connection string it substitutes the name for the connection string. And that's important for two reasons. One is it makes our life a lot simpler. We create the connection string, we're good to go. And then we name it so it's easy to understand. And very important, if I have 4 or 5 different connections, maybe I'm connecting to an Access database, to an Excel, to a SQL database, to a MySQL database, a SQL Server, you can have more than one connection name, connection string in your system. So that's important because you may want to, for this grid, I'm connecting to this, there, and there. And so the names make it easier to manage it. Now, another area which I want to just kind of dive into for 1 minute here is that the security system. When you set up the security system, Alpha stores that data into a database and that information there. So it wants a connection string. So just kind of a word to wise is when I set up any system here, I'll actually set up 2 connection strings. They may point to the same data source initially, like let's say I'm using this Access database for both my application data and my security data. I'll actually create 2 connection names in there, and they both point to the same database, but they're 2 different ones. And the reason why is maybe down the road you go, oh, you know what? I really want to say have my security system pointing to a different database. Then I can leave the first one alone and just change the second one that points to that other database, and you're off to the races. That's really valuable if you have like multiple Alpha applications and each one is using the same security setup. It's a handy deal from there. That's kind of thing from there. So name connection strings are very powerful. You also see when we go to publishing, what you can do is you can say, for this name connection string, here is my local connection string. So you're telling it there, but then you can say, when I publish it, I want this name connection string to have a different connection string connected to somewhere else. So by doing that, the cool thing is in your application, your grids and stuff are going to point to this A demo Northwind or whatever you've named that connection string. And so the system goes, oh, okay, this grid is trying to talk to A demo Northwind. Okay, oh, look, this is the type of data where it's located, etc. And that's how my local system works. Then when I published it, I actually substitute this connection string on the server I'm publishing to, but the same process occurs. It says, oh, this grid is based on AA demo Northwind. Great. I go, oh, look at this connection string. Okay, I'm going to use that to actually talk to the data source. So this name connection string is important because it allows you behind the scenes to swap out the actual connection string by virtue of what your publishing profile and your environment from there. So that makes life really, really simple and easy. You can have, a publishing profile for your UAT environment, and therefore you could have one set of data strings that you want, databases you're hooking up to. And then when you go to production, you have another set really makes things flexible there. We're going to come back and talk about dynamic connection strings in a bit. That's actually an even more powerful concept, but I don't want to get too belabored on there. But let's go ahead and dive into this a little bit more. First, again, as we mentioned, you can export and import these connection strings. So if you're setting up a new project, you can export them, go over there, import them, and you save yourself a lot of typing and clicking and other things like that. But all you have to do to set up a connection string is click new. Actually, you know, I'm going to delete this one real quick because I want to show you a nice little capability. Notice this is when you start a new project, you're going to see you have a new, you basically have a blank screen when you come here. There's no connection strings kind of defaulted into Alpha Anywhere. And you'll notice that we have this little link right here that says create a connection string. So I can click on that, and this comes up with a little dialog box, and it's new. This is a little older. Excuse me. Frankly, what Dave has, and I did not give it to him, I'm kind of finally recovering from it, so that's why I coughed, and I apologize. Actually, this is looks new on the newer releases, because right now, when I click here, it's going to create a access database I use for that. The newer version is you can also pick either an access database or a SQLite database, which is really cool because that's basically just a file you can move around along with it. So again, if yours looks a little differently here, don't freak out. It's basically you have a newer, better version than I do. So for this demo from there, but then you just click OK. It does give you an option. It says, no, keep any edits that are on that database or make a clean copy. Usually I create a clean copy, especially if I'm doing a demo Northwind, because then I know exactly what data is in there. So I'll go ahead and click new copy. And at that point, it says the name string has been called and there's been created. So very easy to get back to it. You see that it's told its access, where it's located at. There's no password, things along those lines. So that's a quick and dirty way for you to add just some sample data into your application, be able to use that. We use it almost always for demos just because then it's easy for them to replicate and do other things there. But the reality is you're going to go, oh, you know what? I need my own connection string. That's not going to work for me. So down here, you click new. You give it a name. And by the way, the convention is CONN. Just if you look at a lot of the demos and history and other things like that, you are welcome to give that connection string anything you want to do. Now, an important distinction here is, and I've seen people do this before, is they won't use the power of the name connection string. They'll do stuff like this, connection dev, and then put in their dev database. And then they'll do connection prod, and they'll put in their connection prod. And then when they go to publish, they have to go through and repoint everything to that connection string. It's a common mistake because it's a misunderstanding of the name connection string concept. The idea you want to do is you want to have a name for your database, in this case, con, and then in your publishing profiles is where you change when you want to go from a development environment to a production to a UAT or a QA or whatever you want to do on that. And again, you don't have to name it CONN. That's just kind of a convention we use around here. Like I'll go CONN and then I'll go CONN security. And those will be the two connection strings that you'll see in my projects when I put them together. But again, you can name it anything you want. But I'd say brevity, try and keep it simple from there. Now you can start typing in the connection string. You could actually paste it in there. But the reality is Alpha has a very powerful builder. So I'm going to click here and click build. So I've added the connection name here, but I'm going to click build. And now you can see the power of connection strings, one of the most powerful things. Here are all the different connection or data sources we can hit. The ones I've talked about, access, MariaDB, MySQL, ODBC, Oracle, Paradox. I mean, man, that's even around. Obviously, SQL Server, SQLite. So there's a huge amount of potential ones, and a lot of these are SQL oriented. And you can see on the left, we actually categorize those. So for instance, if I click here, it reduces, oh, does it do that? There we go. It reduces this down to what are SQL-oriented ones. So it just saves you a little time. Now, the reality is most people are using a SQL database. They're either using SQL Server, MySQL, Oracle, really simple from that standpoint there. There's a couple other that are in here that we kind of treat like SQL is Excel. You can literally point to an Excel file and treat it like a little data source from that standpoint there. Obviously, our friend Access, ODBC, if you already have a system that has ODBC set up and pointed to a specific database, et cetera, we can go through ODBC to connect to those areas. And that actually is pretty powerful because even though we have all these built into it, there are third-party vendors that create ODBC drivers for like very old databases, weird situations, etc. And so if you have a strange situation, you can get an ODBC driver and then use that in alpha, and then they do all the heavy lifting of some of that translation stuff for you. So that's pretty there. But also we support something like NoSQL APIs. So primarily MongoDB. These are NoSQL. They use JSON key value pairs. Very powerful, really nice for prototyping. And we support those kind of capabilities within there. Let's see, let's go here. We also do DBAAS, which is database as a service. So for instance, if you're connecting to SharePoint, if you have a Microsoft environment, or OData, which is another standard out there that allow you to kind of connect to different types of data sources, we support there. I'm sure, let's see, we got a file one here. Yeah, you can even go to static JSON. So this is kind of cool. Probably wouldn't recommend it for something serious, but if you just had a big thing of static JSON, you could essentially treat it like a data source and read and write it. I think if you're doing any kind of prototyping these days, Alpha has actually added a huge amount of support for SQLite, and SQLite is very portable, very easy to use, something I really enjoy, and I've been using that more and more. If you look in the sort of the coding world, people really like SQLite. The other one that's getting a lot, it's interesting, I'm not sure how many people are seeing it, but I see Postgres is really, really popular, especially with, more React and other kind of newer technology frameworks. They tend to like that Postgres. I think there's a lot of built-in functionality. And again, you can get free versions of it, and then they have really nice paid versions of it. But that's getting a lot of there. So long-winded, but the idea is you walk in here, you get this whole world of things you can select, and you can pick from them. So I'm going to just, for purposes today, I'm going to select a couple. I'm going to go access. So now that you've done that, you're going to see it brings up a create SQL connection string user interface. And this will look different based on the type of data source you've selected, because it needs to know different information for you. And then it's going to build through this user interface this SQL string, our connection string. So first it's asking me where the file name is. So I go in and select file name. I don't know where that is. Let's see. Yeah, let's go here. Let's go C, program files x86, A5v12, and then let's go down to MDB. Notice that if you go in when we do an installation in the A5v12 installation, that's the development environment, we include MDB files, and it's kind of cool. It's got Alpha Sports and Northwind in there. So you could actually copy that, move that elsewhere, and be able to connect to it. See, I think there's also a couple older ones here. Not sure how up to date they are, but I'll go ahead and pick Alpha Sports because I want something different. So you notice it's building the file name here. And as you build it, you see up here the connection string that it's building. User password, I don't need one for this, but if that Access database was protected, you can put that in. If it's in a workgroup file, you can do that. And then you can have some other elements here. We've covered this about a month ago. Trace SQL, what happens if you enable that is that any call that's made to this named data source, it will write a log file. So be very careful on that because that will grow very quickly. But if you're doing some debugging, it really is nice to be able to do there. Now, what's cool is once I've got that ready to go, before I even save this, I can test it. And what it's going to do is it's going to do a call to that data source, given the parameters you have here, and let you know if it succeeded or not. And that's critical. You absolutely want to do that because then you avoid the, why doesn't my connection string connect? You kind of solve it here because you might have fumble fingered a password or an IP address or things like that. Like for instance, let me go ahead and I'll go ahead and save this one. So I've got my connection, now I've got my new connection string there. Well, let me go through this real quick. Let me go ahead and say it's connection SQL. Go here. Let's just go ahead and pick MySQL and we'll build that. And you'll notice, oh, I hit the wrong button, MySQL. There we go. Oh, I think I hit a button. There we are. Okay. So you'll notice it brings up this, and you'll notice that this builder is different. In fact, it's much more complex because MySQL as an implementation is not a single file. It's got a lot of parameters to it. So, you can give it what version you're connecting to, the host name where it's at, the port, username, password. Once you fill these out, you can hit refresh, you'll call and show you the databases there. And again, as I mentioned before, make sure you test the connection. But it also envisions a lot of modern technologies. Newer versions of MySQL use IPv6, so you get a little more secure kind of, and this actually talks about what goes on from here and what that's used from that. you can use the trace here. But you'll notice also we have things like TLS SSL. That's very important because that allows you to secure the conversation between Alpha and that database. It actually encrypts the request to the database and the data coming back so nobody can snoop on that line. Very handy, very nice to have from there. You could also use SSH tunneling. So if you have a very specific environment where you can't reach that IP of that, whereas you're using something like a tunneling technology for security purposes, you can go through and give it, how am I connecting, and do all those pieces there. And then a few other commands you can do things here to optimize. So as you can see, this is far more complex than a access database because you have a lot more parameters here. And as I mentioned, you just go through, fill this out, hit test connection. Once you're good there, it'll build that information here. Most importantly is when you're putting in the password, it will encrypt that password so that someone can't just open it up and see. And in fact, if you reopened up this page or this builder and looked at the password, it would like have stars. So you wouldn't even be able to see that, you know, you can kind of snoop from there, and it encrypts it and it keeps it in an encrypted fashion, which is kind of handy from there. So now that I've got this set up, these things here, I can now go in and start building components. And let's go ahead and go to grid, and I'll just keep a simple grid. And now when you're building components and doing the other pieces there in your query, the first thing it's going to do is saying, hey, where am I getting my information from? Where am I dealing with? So I'll go ahead and do con, okay? And then I go in here and connect to it. And now you'll notice that it's smart enough to call into that database and figure out everything for you. So since it knows where that database is at, it can talk to it. Two, since it knows what the kind of data source it is, it goes ahead and can do inspection like this so you don't have to figure it out. And it also knows how to write the underlying SQL and other commands to actually talk to that source and bring that data back in there. And that's one of the powerful things. And once I've clicked OK on this, let's just go ahead and do this. You'll see that this connection string is now called connection, C-O-N-N. And if I save this UX, then anytime, I'm sorry, this grid, anytime this grid comes up, it's going to use that connection string to go find that data. Thus, if this is running locally, I am going to be using this connection string right here. But when I go to publish it and I create a new publishing profile, in fact, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and create a new profile real quick. And I'll go this, I'll go, let's say it's, you know, ISP remote, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to test that. This is the FTP to get up to that server. Don't worry about it. I think it's just there. Yeah. Okay. And finish there. What's important is you'll see in here, you have named alpha DAO connection strings. So I open that up here. You'll see that currently it's set to default value. So what that means is that if I were to go ahead and just publish this up to my server, excuse me, what it would do is it would use that same connection stream I'm using locally to connect to that database. Now that will probably fail, like if it's access, it's not going to get back down to my device and be able to access it. So in this case, you can go in here and build it and go through the same exact process here to build the connection string that you want it to use on that particular environment. But you'll notice that the name is still the same, so that therefore when that grid runs up on the server, it says, oh, I'm in connection, I go here, it looks up what the connection string setup is for that particular environment, translates that, then runs it. So then you don't have to do any of that work. And again, I've seen a couple of people like set up different connection strings for their develop and everything, and then have to on the fly go back and say, oh, I'm going to publish this, I need to rename the, you just don't have to do all that stuff. It's just a common mistake. I don't know if many people make that there, but you'll notice we have it both for also storage connection strings, SQL sorting, server reporting. So in your publishing profile, you can completely reconfigure sort of environmental variables. And these are essentially environmental variables saying in this environment, use this information for that particular situation there. Now, I want to cover one other key thing here, actually two key things here. First, I want to go to and show you something really cool. First, you'll notice that when I created my connection string here, I called it, let me go right here, sorry, CONN, okay? Now there's a new feature that just came out. While I highlight it, it's really cool when you're doing a little more advanced kind of stuff here. It's called the default connection string. Let's see if did I put it in here, or is that in the? Bear with me. I should have had this already up. My apologies. Maybe it's in the pre-release. Let me check that real quick. This one's so new. It's cool. Some new image acting. Cool. Nope, I guess it is in the production. But basically allows you, which is really cool, and if you are building an application, you don't have to always remember what that connection string is. You can designate the default one, and therefore it will even substitute the name of the connection string. It's a little bit more of a kind of a geeky, may not use that in everyday kind of stuff. Let me see if I can find that. I just found it. It's very cool. Bear with me. I won't waste much more time. I'll find it and put it in there. Let's go. And come on. There it is. Here you go. In all places where you are prompted for a name connection string, you can now specify by default to use a default connection string. The default connection string is defined in the web project properties to open that from there. Now you may go, well, why is that really cool? Well, the cool thing about that is, let's say you've created a cool component and it's going to reference a table. If you move it from one project to another one, it's going to retain whatever that named connection string is. So let's say in project 1, I called it, SQL DB 110. In project 2, I called it SQL DB 1. Well, now I have to go in and rebuild that UX or that grid to support that different name. But if I had defined a default and I define the default at project level, I can literally move that component from one project to the other, and boom, it will just run. Now, obviously, it's going to look for whatever underlying data table or other things like that. So it's just kind of a really nice, neat new way, which I think is really powerful, that allows you to kind of build reusable components and other things like that, because you're not hard coding the name of the connection string into the component itself. Because you may want to decide on this other project, we're going to call this connection string something else. Then when I move that component in there, it's just going to say, oh, project, who's the default connection string? Oh, okay, I'm going to substitute in there and then do my calls from that standpoint. And again, you'll have to make sure the underlying data source actually has all the information that is required by that component or grid. So I thought that was really cool. And what's really neat too, and this is mainly, it's really nice in Grid and UX Builder, but also in the xbasic code, you can now actually issue something saying, instead of opening a specific connection string. So what's kind of cool about that is you can create code libraries that will work nicely without having a whole bunch of embedded. And I've always hated that in the past, is I've always had to put in my connection string. So whenever I moved code from one thing to another, I always had to go through and edit my code, and I'd invariably miss a connection string name, and it would just fail because it would say, oh, I'm trying to connect to the database and I don't know what connection string that name. So it's really cool, very, very handy, and I think very useful from there. Now, the other thing I want to show you while I was here, and then we'll open it up for questions, was also, go here, what's called, and I'm not going to go much here, we've talked about it before, but is called the dynamic connection string. This is super powerful. So as I mentioned, you can swap, you can have a name of a connection string and then swap it in publishing profiles. But what's great about this is that you can actually create a dynamic connection string, and it uses a very specific naming convention. And then you can store in the session variable that connection string, and literally on the fly, the system can say, oh, okay, this is the connection string. So it's using that name connection string, that special one, but literally you can say, oh, when you go to actually run, go from here. Now, where that's valuable is the following. As great as an example as a multi-tenant scenario, and then we actually have another technology handle that piece there. But let's say you had a multi-tenant scenario where each tenant of your application gets a different database. So the question becomes, if you have 10 customers, do you deploy 10 different alpha environments and rename all the connection strings or the underlying data to point at the different databases, what you can do is you can have them log in. And when they log in, you can say, oh, they're with this organization. Let's set up this connection string and point them at this database. So it's really cool for those multi-tenant environments because it allows you on the fly and then everything else just works. And the beauty of it is then you don't have to worry about commingling customer data and things like that. So I wanted to bring that up because I think it's a really powerful, I'm going to go ahead and put there. It's something to note having your there you go. Your arsenal is that, you can literally on the fly, that's right. On the fly, you can swap out a connection string and point to a completely different database during the process. And I'm talking about multi-tenant, but it may be something where you have a situation where you have customers around the United States and they have on-site database to premise databases where they're doing stuff. You may have a system in alpha which says, oh, okay, I'm going to punch out to this one, and talk to those different databases elsewhere. You may not even have control of it. So there's a lot of really cool ways you can work that. And it's a very straightforward. And there's really good documentation. Thank you, Sarah, that shows you how to set it up. What are the names of it? Here's an example of how to use it. And you can also use xbasic expressions, which are kind of cool. Just there's a lot of really neat tricks that are around there that I wanted to open that up from there. And again, these examples are really, really ample. And you'll see there's actually another article here called Building Multi-Tenant Applications Using Dynamic Connection Strings. And this is a very popular one. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to paste that and send that to you guys. Because this is a class case. Each tenant has its own database. How would I go ahead and set those pieces up right there? So really handy tools, things like that. So with that, I think I've jabbered enough. I know I took off most of the time, but I hope you have a better understanding of the core concepts behind what are connection strings and what do they do for you. A real quick recap is they allow you to connect to different data sources. It encapsulates a lot of the complexity. So once you've kind of set it up, it'll take care of worrying about how to fill a grid or populate a UX or save a record or do things like that. It is a normalized way, especially when you get into xbasic, that really handles a lot of things for you. And then again, it has a lot of flexibility in terms of publishing and multi-tenant that you can apply to your application. So you don't have to create these really weird DevOps situations going, oh, I have to have 4 versions of my application, keep them in sync because each one points to a different database. None of that is necessary. It's really well thought out from that standpoint. So I will hush and see if we have any kind of question.
We do have a few questions. So thank you very much, Dion. That was great, actually. Very well.
Glad you liked it.
Yeah, no, it's good. I love going back and reviewing this stuff. It just sort of helps reinforce the foundations that you need to know whenever you're building an app. But we did have a few questions, and I think you kind of addressed this earlier, but I just want to ask it again because it's probably a question a lot of people may be asking during COVID times. We were all working remote or have to work remote for some reason. And this person asks, they have a MySQL server in their office on a server, and they have an IP address for connecting to that from their office machine. But their question is, how do I get the right connection string so I can access that at home from my laptop?
I have that situation on a couple of different accounts, different people I work with. So first, and this is probably not the case, if that IP address is public, then you can connect in both locations, no problem at your home. But reality is most likely that IP address is probably internal. So if it's within the firewall at the office environment, your next step is, can you VPN? Is there a way for your laptop to securely connect into the network at your office so it looks like you're on that environment? And that's option 2. And that would be something your corporate IT group would set up for you, and most likely exists because you're going to need a way to get into resources. They don't really want to put out a bunch of public IPs and other things like that. A lot of companies are moving towards, hosting that stuff in the cloud. So if it's on AWS or Azure, and often they'll have public IP addresses or methods to connect from there. And again, as you saw, there are other things like SSH tunneling. Some companies may use that. That's built into the situation. Now, one other option, and I use this a fair amount, especially with more high secure environments, is I literally use an RDP to RDP into a machine that's running in the office. And therefore, there's two benefits. One is then nothing is on my local machine here out in the outside world. I punch in through the RDP, there's security protocols and policies. I just do all my development on the machine literally located in that environment. And then the one thing that's really nice about that is that when I stop, I just close the window, and then I can go to another machine and do the exact same thing, or I can go in the office and actually step in front of the machine and start continuing to work. It's pretty good. A lot of my work now, I'm on a Mac, as you could probably get a feel for it there. I do all of my development work on VMs. So when I'm like when I'm over here and I'm doing this right here, well, actually, this is a remote desktop to an AWS machine that I'm using to do my development. So everything I was doing right here, as you can see, is very snappy. I mean, the newer tech, given the speed of stuff, is like super fast. I find the only time you may have weird if you have wonky internet connection, that could be a drag, but makes your life really simple. And I don't know if people saw, and I kind of threw this out to other people, is that, or to some other groups, is that actually our big friends up in Redmond is setting up a 365 VM. I think it's called this. They're just announced it. Oh, that's Dynamics 365. Let's see, let's call it remote desktop. Which one is it? Office 365 VM. So they are, I don't have the actual article. Oh, here it is. There's the one right here. So Microsoft is actually getting ready to offer basically a dedicated VM system where you can go to them, sign up, and it's for businesses to start out with, but they'll actually on their Azure environment, they'll spin up a Windows desktop for you, give you an RDP, and actually I'm using what's called Microsoft RDP, which is remote desktop. They actually are building apps that you will download on your local machine. And what's great is that, and this is so wild, the native apps are going to be for Mac, PC, and iPad. So you'll literally be able to open up an iPad and literally punch into a VM and have a full Windows box basically running right there. And it's really fast. The cool thing about that too, and again, I'm not selling this service, but one of the coolest things often is when you're I'm on this remote here, when I do downloads and stuff, I'm not downloading locally here in my office. It's up on some RDS server. It's up on in my case, an AWS server. So downloads are insanely fast because they have all this fiber. It's in the data center. So it's literally you just boom, it's done. So there's a lot of advantage to that. So something to keep in mind. So I'm sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent. This is really exciting for me because one of the coolest things is they are creating a native Windows application and native Mac application and native iPad application, which will be able to download. My guess is they'll probably do a native Chrome desktop. So you'll be able to literally do stuff like that. And I think they'll do really well on it. But in your case, find out if that IP is public. Secondly, if not, how can you VPN so you can be on the network to be able to access that? Worst comes to worst, and that's where the this functionality works is if you can put on your laptop MySQL or SQL Server, create a copy of that database and take it on your local, then you can literally set up and do your develop locally because you can modify your Alpha DAO connection string to being local here. And then when you're up in your office, you can swap that out and use the other, the actual office. But often that's not reasonable because there's secure data or things like that. So I hope that gives you some pointers on where to do, but I think you'll be able to find it. So.
All right, thank you. There aren't a lot of basic questions, so we're going to start asking some of the hard ones.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, but this one may not be too hard. Can a single UX component have multiple lists that use different connection strings as the data source for each list?
Wait, I'm sorry, it clicked. Run that by me again, I apologize.
The question is, can your UX component have, let's say, 2 lists, and can each list have a different connection string?
Yes, absolutely. So if you're creating a UX, let's go ahead and let's see, web component, UX. I'm using a little older version, so that's there. When you create your list control, let's go ahead and go here, we'll create a list. Yeah. When you create your list, in the quick setup genie, you can connect to, like I can connect this one to here, and then I can create a second list from there. And then therefore you could be literally have on the same screen two lists, one list pointed to completely separate databases from that standpoint. Now, again, what's kind of important is once you connect to the list to that, then all the functionality on this list will be related to that one data source or connection string. So you won't be able to do strange things like I want to pick these two fields from this database on this connection string and these here. It's kind of once you point the list one connection string, then you're working within that environment there. But you can definitely have multiple lists on the same UX pointed to separate different data sources. No problem at all.
Great, thank you. Along the same vein of multiple databases, this person wanted to know if it is possible to do a join across different databases in a single statement with xbasic.
Not that I'm aware of. No way to do a join across them unless there's some native functionality. It's possible. I mean, I think you can do in xbasic, you can have different schema. Now, are they two different data sources or are they two different databases within the same data source, same connection? My guess is it's two different databases in the same. In that case, you can use the schema concept, I think, to do multi-database joins, but that's really beyond what I normally do. So I'm not sure on there. And that would really be just a limitation of that database technology. When you're using things like Microsoft Server, SQL Server and stuff like that, you have the concept of what's called a schema. So you could literally write a database connection, but most of our connection strings are really connected to a single database. And I think that may be an inherent limitation in this situation.
Yeah, and it sounds like what they want to do is collect data from both databases and then combine it in some fashion.
And the answer is you can absolutely do, because
yeah.
what I've done, which is cool, is I can bring that in and basically put it into a set of tables on a third database, my local one, or just store it in memory as pointers or something like that, and then do the work there. So, but it definitely will be a matter of extracting the data you need and then creating a way to handle it from there. List may be the way to do that, because what you can do is use the list because the list basically just brings down JSON and then has it available. And there's a whole bunch of really cool features built into list to walk the rows and things like that. So an easy way maybe is just have the two lists and then talk to the list to talk to the data itself. But that's kind of a secondary way you might be able to approach that. So
let's see here. Oh, we have a question here. Someone's asking what type of tool do you use when you work with PostgreSQL?
My favorite tool is Navicat. I have the premium version, which then will work with multiple sources. So I have, for instance, that's a Postgres right here. I have just a fun one I'm playing up on DigitalOcean. So you can see now I'm seeing here's my users on DigitalOcean. And this is a Postgres there. You can see it's got a little elephant head there. But then this is a MySQL. This is an EC2 dev. So it's on, it's like a SQL server, etc. So I use Navicat mainly because it allows me to have a single tool and work the same way across multiple databases. It's sort of like Alpha in terms of taking care of that, but it isn't, you have to pay for it. The pro version is, I think, $300 or something like that. But the amount of time I spend working on databases makes sense to me. That said, you can also use free tools like PHP admin for MySQL on certain hosting companies give you these free tools. I think Postgres has some like workbenches you can work on that. And then there's some free open source things, but my go-to is Navicat. And Navicat, if you're working with multiple, I use the Pro, but if you're only working with one technology, they do sell like MySQL specific ones, Postgres specific ones. So it's a little less expensive to buy just that, I'm using this technology, but I use it so much. It's got a visual query builder and other things like that. Pretty good. The other tool I've used, which is more expensive, but it's called DB Forge. And the main reason I like that one is it does like schema compares and things like that. But check out Navicat. You know, good company, been around a long time, and it, you know, their stuff works and it works really well. And they have what's also kind of cool is a cloud storage for your connection string information. So if you have like 2 machines, you can kind of store all that so you don't have to keep copying them between machines. And the one I use again, so you can see they support MySQL, SQL Server. They also now support things like MongoDB, but let's see here. And again, don't get paid by them. So I use the premium one because I can connect to any of these type I need to. But there is one dedicated for MySQL, for Postgres, for there, and those are significantly less expensive to purchase. Good questions, thank you.
Yeah, we have a few more. One person did ask, what about Community Edition? Everything that we're talking about here, you can do it in Community Edition. The only limitations on Community Edition with respect to data sources is DBFs. We don't allow you to connect to DBF files with Community Edition, and that's by and large because the only server we allow you to publish to with Community Edition is Alpha Cloud, and you can't use DBFs on Alpha Cloud. So that's really the main limiting factor there. But everything else that Dion talked about today, absolutely Community Edition.
I think we'll have DBS forever. I think they're never going away.
They're not great for web and mobile app development, unfortunately.
No.
I don't know if we can answer this in the time we've got left.
Sure, we'll give it a shot.
I'm sure the answer myself. But someone asked, when you encrypt a field in a list, does it send and receive the data encrypted or just save it in the SQL database as encrypted?
Oh, it send and receive. My understanding, it sends and receives it, meaning that in the database, it is encrypted. When we call it, it grabs that value and brings it down to the list and then decrypts it there, shows it to the person, they can manipulate it. And then when the list goes ahead and you edit it, it encrypts it and then sends that back through the normal sort of update process to the backend database. So my understanding, and maybe someone or someone will correct me, is that the data that is in Fly is what was in the data source on the server, which means encrypted, and it's only decrypted and handled locally. Thus, that's handy for things like HIPAA and stuff like that. But again, that's my understanding, so we may want to do a double check.
Yeah, probably should double check that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trust, but verify.
Mm-hmm. So looks like we are
great
out of questions about data sources. There is one here about alpha launch.
I'll let you handle that one.
Yeah, I can handle that one. In fact, if the person who asked that question can send us an email to guides@alphasoftware.com, I can follow up with them. It's a bit more to the answer to that question than I can cover here in 3 minutes.
Cool. Hey, but thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sarah.
Well, thank you.
Get well, Dave. Get well, Dave.
Get well, Dave. Yeah. Bummer he couldn't join us today.
Excellent.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Dion, for presenting. We will be back next week with another exciting topic on some of the basics. I believe the next one we're going to try to tackle is storage connections. If you do not know what that is, please show up next week. It's you're going to want to know about it. That one is
awesome. There's so many benefits of using web-based storage. It's awesome. Got to be there.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. And again, sign up for DevCon 2021. And then I'm just going to mention it here at the end. We do have something. It's called learn.alphasoftware.com. It's a project I've been working on for a bit now. We're starting to ramp up to the point where we're going to start talking more about it. But if you're curious about that, you can go to that website and check out what's going on there. And with that, I'm going to bid you all goodbye. See you next week.